Even decades after his death, George Harrison remains one of the most beloved figures in music history, a man known for his quiet nature, spiritual wisdom, and timeless songwriting. But behind that calm, gentle image was a side of George that very few people ever saw, a man capable of deep anger, resentment, and heartbreak. And there was one person in particular who, according to those closest to him, he truly hated. Fans have long speculated about the tension between George and his fellow Beatles, especially Paul McCartney, but the real story goes far beyond simple creative differences. It involves love, betrayal, jealousy, and wounds that never fully healed. For years, George kept his pain private, speaking about it only in cryptic lyrics and brief interviews. But those who knew him best, his friends, bandmates, and family, say that behind closed doors, his anger toward one woman shaped much of his later life. The woman in question was someone who had been a major part of his personal world, whose actions left scars that no amount of fame or meditation could erase. George once described her betrayal as a lesson in attachment, yet his closest friends said it was the only time they ever saw him truly broken. As time passed, George tried to forgive, to find peace through spirituality and music. But even in his final years, that shadow lingered. So who was she? And what did she do that drove the most spiritual Beatle to such bitterness? The truth will shock even the most devoted fans. Before the fame, the chaos, and the spiritual journey that defined his later life, George Harrison was simply a shy young man from Liverpool with an unshakable passion for music. Born in 1943, George grew up in a working-class family where his love for the guitar became both his escape and his identity. By the time he joined the Beatles, he was only a teenager, but he already had a unique sensitivity that set him apart from John Lennon's rebelliousness and Paul McCartney's ambition. While John and Paul dominated the spotlight, George quietly honed his craft, writing songs that carried a depth and vulnerability unmatched by his peers. But behind that calm demeanor, he yearned for something deeper: connection, loyalty, and spiritual peace. These were qualities he thought he found when he met Pattie Boyd, a young model who would change his life forever. George met Pattie in 1964 on the set of A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' first feature film. She was elegant, charming, and seemed to embody everything the young Beatle dreamed of: beauty, innocence, and grace. He fell for her instantly, famously asking her to marry him on their very first date. For a time, their love story seemed like something out of a fairy tale. They were one of the most glamorous couples of the 1960s, adored by fans and photographers alike. But behind the picture-perfect image, their marriage was far from peaceful. Fame had its price, and George's growing obsession with spirituality began to clash with Pattie's need for attention and affection. While George spent long hours meditating or recording music, Pattie often felt neglected and lonely. As the years passed, emotional distance began to grow between them, a gap that someone else would soon exploit. That someone else was Eric Clapton, George's close friend and one of the most gifted guitarists in the world. Clapton had long admired George, but what started as admiration soon turned into something darker. He fell deeply, hopelessly in love with Pattie Boyd, his best friend's wife. At first, George thought it was harmless flirtation. But by the early 1970s, the tension was impossible to ignore. Clapton openly confessed his love for Pattie, even writing the haunting song Layla as a declaration of his obsession with her. The music world was stunned, but no one more so than George himself. The man he considered a brother had betrayed him, and the woman he loved was torn between two men. The affair shattered George's trust, not just in Pattie, but in the people around him. Though the three of them remained entangled in a strange and painful triangle for years, the emotional scars were permanent. George would later admit that the experience changed him forever, stripping away much of the warmth and faith he once had in love. While he publicly downplayed the feud, insiders revealed that George's resentment toward Pattie grew deeper with time. He felt humiliated, betrayed by his wife and his best friend in front of the entire world. Though he eventually forgave Clapton in public, calling him a fine musician and a good friend, those closest to George knew the forgiveness was only surface level. In private, He often spoke bitterly about how fame destroyed genuine relationships. "People take what they want," he once said, "and call it love." Those words, spoken years after the affair, revealed just how deeply the betrayal had cut him. What began as a storybook romance had become a painful chapter of loss and disillusionment. And for George Harrison, it was the beginning of a wound that time would never fully heal. When George Harrison's personal life began to intertwine with his music, few could have predicted the storm that was about to unfold. The Beatles were disbanded, and each member was finding his own path. For George, it was a period of spiritual exploration and emotional turbulence. But behind the scenes, one woman would cause more emotional turmoil than any critic or rival ever could. That woman was his wife, Pattie Boyd, the same woman who would later capture the heart of his closest friend, Eric Clapton. George and Pattie's relationship had once been the stuff of fairy tales. She was the beautiful model who had inspired songs like "Something" and "I Need You." Their love seemed poetic, even destined. But fame, temptation, and the pressures of being part of one of the most famous bands in the world took their toll. George's spiritual journey often clashed with Pattie's desire for affection and attention. While George was seeking inner peace through meditation and Eastern philosophy, Pattie felt increasingly alone. By the early 1970s, cracks began to show. George's infidelity became an open secret, including a shocking affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. Pattie was devastated, but she stayed, hoping that her husband would return to the man she once loved. Instead, she found herself drifting further away. During this fragile period, Eric Clapton, one of George's closest friends, entered the picture in a way no one could have imagined. Clapton had fallen deeply in love with Pattie. Despite knowing she was married to his best friend, his passion for her was so consuming that it inspired one of rock's greatest love songs, Layla. It was a confession in musical form, a desperate cry from a man tortured by forbidden love. When George heard the song, he knew instantly who it was about. Yet in his calm, almost detached manner, he said nothing publicly. Their circle of friends was left speechless. How could one of rock's most iconic friendships survive such a betrayal? Pattie, torn between loyalty and longing, eventually left George for Clapton. What followed was a bizarre and painful love triangle that played out in front of the world. George's bitterness was quiet but undeniable. He once reportedly told friends, "I loved her once, but not anymore." She chose her path. Still, in a moment that baffled many, George attended Eric and Pattie's wedding in 1979, standing face to face with the man who had stolen his wife. It was one of the most awkward yet iconic moments in rock history. Beneath his composed exterior, George was deeply wounded. To him, Pattie had become a symbol of everything he despised about fame: the superficiality, the betrayal, and the emotional chaos it brought. In later interviews, George rarely spoke about Pattie, but when he did, his tone carried a quiet resentment. He saw her as part of a painful chapter that distracted him from his true purpose, his music and spirituality. While Pattie claimed that George had grown distant and cold, George saw it differently. He believed she couldn't understand the kind of peace he was seeking, even years later. After George's passing, Pattie often spoke fondly of their time together, calling him the love of my life. But for George, that love had long since faded into something more complicated, a mix of sadness, disappointment, and regret. What hurt most wasn't just losing his wife. It was losing his friend. Eric Clapton's betrayal cut deep, leaving scars that never fully healed. George may have forgiven them both publicly, but privately. Those wounds shaped his outlook on trust and friendship forever. Behind his calm demeanor and spiritual wisdom lay the quiet pain of a man who had seen love turn to heartbreak and friendship turn to rivalry. Pattie Boyd wasn't just the woman who broke his heart. She was the woman who made him realize how fragile even the deepest bonds could be. After Pattie Boyd left George Harrison for Eric Clapton, something inside George changed forever. He no longer looked at love the same way, nor did he view friendship with the same warmth he once had. What had once been a circle of brotherhood among rock legends now felt like a web of betrayal and hurt. Though George projected calmness in public, his close friends could sense the anger simmering beneath the surface. In interviews, George often deflected questions about Patty and Eric with humor or vague remarks. But behind those polite smiles there was resentment. To many who knew him personally, George had always been the most sensitive of the Beatles, deeply introspective and emotionally complex. When Patty left, it wasn't merely the loss of a wife. It was the feeling of being replaced, of being unseen in his own story. He buried his pain in music. His songs from the mid to late 1970s carried undertones of heartbreak and disillusionment. So Sad from Dark Horse and This Guitar, Can't Keep from Crying, were quiet confessions, a way for George to process the betrayal he couldn't express in words. Through his lyrics, he spoke of love lost, friends turned strangers, and a heart struggling to find peace. While Eric Clapton publicly struggled with his own demons, addiction, guilt, and fame, George remained composed, channeling his energy into spirituality. But that calmness wasn't forgiveness. It was detachment. Those closest to him, including Olivia Harrison, would later say that George often dismissed emotional pain by turning it into spiritual lessons. Yet even then, there were moments when his eyes betrayed the truth, a flicker of bitterness that refused to fade. The strangest part of this triangle was how it evolved into a bizarre friendship. After years of awkwardness, George, Eric, and Patty found themselves in the same social circles again. At concerts and private events, they exchanged polite smiles, but the air was thick with unspoken history. When George performed at Clapton's Crossroads event years later, fans saw it as proof that all had been forgiven. But those who knew George knew better. Forgiveness maybe, but forgetfulness never. George had always been a man of contrasts. The same person who could meditate for hours and preach compassion could also hold a quiet, lifelong grudge. He wasn't vindictive, but he didn't easily let go of pain. To him, betrayal was sacred ground. Once crossed, it could never be the same. In private moments, George confided that he no longer trusted easily. The Patty-Eric affair had taught him that love and loyalty were fragile, even among the people you thought you knew best. When he found love again with Olivia Arias, his second wife, he became fiercely protective of his personal life. Gone were the days of public romance and open vulnerability. Olivia brought stability, but George's heart still carried the scars from his past. Even years later, during interviews in the 1990s, when asked about the Layla saga, George responded dryly, "It's all old news." But that tone, detached and sharp, revealed that the wounds had never truly healed. Deep down, he resented how his most painful personal chapter had become rock history, something for fans to romanticize rather than understand. Patty's departure and Eric's betrayal shaped George's worldview more than most realized. They pushed him further into his spiritual path, but also further away from human connection. He poured his soul into his garden at Friar Park, finding peace not in people, but in nature. It became his refuge, a place where he could finally be free from fame, heartbreak, and the ghosts of his past. George Harrison's bitterness wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, poetic, and deeply human, a reminder that even the most enlightened souls can be broken by love.
He had forgiven Patty and Eric in words.
But in his music, his silence and his eyes, the truth was clear. The pain had never fully left him. As the years passed, George Harrison began to retreat more and more from the public eye. The fame that once defined him now felt like a burden, and the noise of the world became too heavy for a soul-seeking peace. His sprawling estate, Friar Park, became both sanctuary and symbol, a fortress of serenity surrounded by the chaos of a past he was finally learning to accept. By the 1990s, George had become the quiet Beatle in every sense. While his bandmates pursued projects and tours, George focused on gardening, meditation, and family. With Olivia Harrison by his side and their son Donnie, he found the kind of grounded love that fame could never offer. Olivia was different, steady, loyal, and deeply spiritual, just like George. She understood his pain, but more importantly, she understood his need for solitude. Though the wounds left by Pattie Boyd and Eric Clapton never disappeared entirely, George's outlook had softened. He often said that everything in life, joy, heartbreak, betrayal, was part of a larger plan. "You have to let go of the ego," he once said. "It's not about who's right or wrong. It's about finding peace within." Those words revealed how far he had come since the turbulent years of heartbreak. Still, there were fleeting moments when his past resurfaced. In rare interviews, when the topic of Pattie or Eric was brought up, George would smile faintly and say, "We're all friends now." But those who truly knew him could sense a lingering sadness, a reflection of a man who had seen too much, loved too deeply, and lost more than most could bear. His music during this era, especially in his final solo works, carried the sound of quiet acceptance. Songs like Any Road and Rising Sun showed an artist who had made peace with his story. When George was diagnosed with cancer, his calm acceptance of mortality astonished everyone around him. Rather than fear, he spoke of transition, of moving from one form of energy to another. He had spent his life searching for spiritual truth, and now he was facing the ultimate test of faith. Olivia stayed by his side through every treatment, every setback, protecting his privacy with unwavering devotion. During those final months, George reconnected with many old friends, including Eric Clapton. It was Eric, in fact, who helped organize his final journey to Los Angeles for treatment, ensuring that George was surrounded by love, not tension. Whatever bitterness had once existed between them had dissolved into mutual respect. It was as if both men, weathered by time and tragedy, understood that the past no longer mattered. Before his passing in November 2001, George spent his last days surrounded by prayer, mantras, and music. Those close to him said his final moments were serene. He left the world as he had lived much of his later life, quietly, gracefully, and with purpose. To the end, he held on to his belief that love and consciousness transcend everything, even pain. After his death, Pattie Boyd spoke tenderly of him, saying, "George was an extraordinary man. I never stopped loving him." Her words reflected what had always been true. Beneath all the betrayal and heartbreak, there had once been genuine love. George's ability to rise above that pain, to live with compassion rather than vengeance, defined his legacy far more than any song or scandal ever could. Today, George Harrison's story remains one of profound transformation. He experienced the deepest forms of love and loss, yet chose to meet them with spiritual grace. The woman he once hated became just another lesson in his journey toward enlightenment. In the end, George didn't die with bitterness in his heart. He died with peace, understanding that love, in all its forms, was both the cause of his suffering and the key to his salvation.